Space Mobile Podcast.
We just basically from their phone be seamless, regardless of where you are. We don't want the user even to know that it's connected by satellite. Listen, the opportunity that we have is very, very, very large.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining. As I said last night, there's probably going to be another one of these spaces because there'll be more news out, and then I'll have to do another space. But yeah, I decided to do just that, host another space. There's been some information that's come out overnight, and then of course I stewed a bit and thought about what Scott had presented at UBS, and kind of piece together what some of the implications are. And so I just wanted to talk about it. So one thing we learned yesterday evening was that American Tower filed a 144. This is in regards to the shares that they own. And so for those that don't know, American Tower has been an early strategic investor. They invested in the company before it was public. I think that was a Series B round. And then they also invested in the company's IPO in 2021. And so the company, American Tower had about 2 point, let me see here, basically 2.5 million Class A shares, and then 2.2 million Class B shares. And yesterday they filed, after the market closed in the evening, that they had, on a 144 basis, had planned to sell 2.29 million of their Class A shares. And so that would bring their total ownership down to around 2.4 million shares. And for some context, American Tower is not in the private VC investing game. I remember hearing from Ed Knapp, the CTO or former CTO, he's now retired, that American Tower never really makes venture investments or investments in other public companies. And so I think yesterday's transaction was to essentially take some money down and recognize a gain. And so American Tower, based off of their private investment and their public investment, the Class A shares they bought at $10. I think the private shares they bought at much lower levels. Maybe it was the 3 level. So I think the average is around 6. So for a $31 million investment, they turned that into $341 million. And so that's not a bad return, 1,000% return on investment. And, I think one thing to keep in mind is that American Tower was an early investor and supporter. And in many ways, I think it was an opportunity for them to kind of hedge their bets and see what this potential industry was going to morph into. And back then they probably saw the potential, but didn't really, fathom the potential disruption of the industry. And so fast forward to today, when you look at American Tower and Crown Castle and SBC, like their business is actually derated quite a bit. The reason why that is this whole idea of direct to sell and satellite coverage, blanketing rural areas or areas where it's uneconomic, that actually crimps quite a bit of growth for these tower companies. Now, obviously, they're still going to be relevant and they're going to charge rents for their towers, but the opportunity to extend out and capture additional CapEx dollars from the MNOs, like some of that's going to be evaporated, right? And perhaps they'll focus more on densification of urban areas and whatever. But yeah, there is a leg of their growth that's being kicked out. And the other thing that exacerbated this and caused a big derating in the stocks is the fact that EchoStar decided to get out of the mobile network operator business. And so, Dish Networks, which eventually merged into EchoStar, I think it spent like $10 billion on CapEx and building out their network to deploy their spectrum. And they still had a long ways to go to meet coverage requirements for the FCC. And as a part of that, obviously they didn't, according to the FCC, they didn't meet their requirements. And then the FCC was like, well, guys, you got to sell your spectrum. And then Charlie Ergen, in a bind, decided to sell his AWS-4 and parts of AWS-3 spectrum to Starlink. And so what does that mean? Well, for the tower companies, Dish was driving a significant part of growth for the entire industry in building out towers to deploy their network. And then EchoStar was like, you know what? We give up. And so that entire growth vector is gone. But not only that, like you're that that area of growth is gone, but then that spectrum that was supposed to be deployed terrestrially is actually going to Starlink, and Starlink is going to bring that to bear to provide coverage across the U.S. For direct to cell. And so not only did you lose that growth vector, now it's being basically used against you, in sense that any potential build out in some of these areas that might need coverage might just get covered by AST Space Mobile or Starlink. And so that's why the towers have been derating recently, and you've seen American Tower raise additional money. I mean, they're always raising money, but these tower companies are pretty leveraged. American Tower in particular has 1.9 billion in cash, but they've got, I think, like over 50 billion of debt. And so by monetizing some of this stake, I think it's probably a smart corporate finance move and something that the board was like, hey, you know what? We're not speculators. It's, our relationship is strategic. And for those unfamiliar, American Tower actually has right of first refusal to build the gateways, the ground, well, the ground stations that will have the gateways, but also host racks of the eNode Bs that integrate into the MNO's core network. And so they are strategic in that sense, that they're a partner, but then, if they, from a right of first refusal, if they decide not to do that, then we'll just partner with someone else. But yeah, that sale yesterday, which typically when you have a 144 filing, the sale happens the same day. And so we saw yesterday the stock, like, for a very short period of time, dipped under 70, and it was like a sloppy seller. I don't know who at Barclays was working the order for them, but I think they screwed that up. But that, selling 2 million shares and change over the course of the day, probably early in the day, relative to an 11 million volume day, that's going to have a pretty big impact on the stock, which is why we saw it flat. But that just goes to show some of the industry disruption. There's for a company like American Tower, which is viewed as like the gold standard for towers, and it's always been a stable business. They're kind of in a strategic crossroads, especially with direct to cell becoming more of a reality. But anyway, I did want to talk about the UBS conference yesterday. And so there were a few things, I did discuss it, but I, thought a bit more about it. And one thing I noted is that, Scott was quite a bit more forthright in terms of his discussion about the company's business. And, he gave us quite a few nuggets. And so if you kind of tie those nuggets together, it actually gives you a pretty interesting picture. And so the first thing I'll touch on is that, he specifically mentioned that they are about to secure additional manufacturing space, which will be solely focused on manufacturing microns. And so I think you would do that because you you obviously want to optimize production and have a dedicated facility where it's not juggling multiple things at once. But I think this whole notion of having a focused effort on pumping out more microns, I think that kind of hints at other potential applications. So if a factory is dedicated to just building, the micron with the solar panel, and then the slots for chips and batteries, but then not necessarily putting the finishing array on, you could see that being utilized as a building block for other applications. And so I think that was an important nugget that the company hasn't disclosed before. And obviously, we're at 500,000 square feet of production, and now they're looking to expand that further. And then the other thing that ties with that is the fact that the company, or Scott specifically mentioned additional shells. And so not only did he talk about a couple of shells, which is block one low band shell, and then block two low band shell, and then what will be block three mid band shell. He also talked about a government shell, and so that's never been disclosed before. And so that, I think, hey, we're gonna ramp up production of microns in particular. We're gonna have it in a completely separate space, which to me says like we're going beyond six, enough micron production for enough for 6 satellites a month. I think they're looking to put up to 10 to 12. But then even beyond just for their needs, they're going to be making these microns for other applications. And so then, he disclosed that this whole idea of a government shell, right? And so I haven't heard that said before. And so if you kind of tie those two things together and what we're on the cusp of, which is hearing back um, about Golden Dome, I think he's kind of tipped his cap that we're expecting some type of Golden Dome award soon, right? And so, in particular, like during the conference, he talked about some of the applications, which is actually I've got to go back. I mean, he talked about radar very specifically and sensing. Just go here, but yeah, that's the first time I've heard the company talk in granularity about other applications. He also discussed connecting various digital assets that are on the battlefield. For example, for those who are following like Anduril, these headsets and goggles and things that will be connected, and obviously like the key thing about which Katsi has pointed out for a connected battlefield is the fact that soldiers are going to be overwhelmed with so much information, right? So a soldier typically, like if you're not that I'm even close to qualified to talk about this, but I can imagine if you're on a battlefield and you've got maybe a headset and you're listening to something in the old days, and then you're looking through your eyes, that's kind of the information that you're receiving. Whereas in the future, everyone's going to be connected. You're going to have a heads up display in your goggles, and there's going to be all kinds of information coming in. And a lot of that stuff is probably not going to be usable. And so you're going to need some level of AI processing to bring the critical pieces of information to the fore for your soldier on the ground. And that's actually interesting because I think one of these folks who was talking about, I think his name is Gavin Backer. He had talked about like AI data centers in space and how having and this was in particular talking about Starlink, but having the ability to do AI compute in space and then delivering that to a connected device on the ground, like you could see how that would be very powerful, right? So if you had, a number of troops or devices that are connected, but they need some level of AI compute, you could actually do that in space, and that connection between space and the ground would be much faster than having to, for example, send the signal up to space and then bounce back down to perhaps like some data center in the US and then it's processed and then it bounces it back and then sends it to the area where there's this conflict happening. And so yeah, maybe you in the future you could have some level of compute, maybe not a completely dedicated satellite that does AI compute, but it will have connectivity to devices and then some level of AI compute on it. Which, by the way, like we already know, AST 5000, the ASIC chip that they have, is going to have a AI layer that, or software that it will be running to optimize, the beamforming and the dedication of resources. For example, like in a particular cell, if there's more users versus a cell where there isn't, then perhaps like the satellite will bring more processing power to bear. And the other interesting thing about the company's beamforming technology is that the antennas, the company has talked about, said projecting down thousands of fixed cell beams. It can actually, within the same array, it could actually focus two beams or three beams on the same cell and create a situation where it's like MIMO, right? And so, and there is a patent. I'll go back and try to find it, but there's a patent where using the same exact array but different elements, you can beam down multiple cells on at the same place and improve throughput. And so that's why AI compute is important for the satellite already, because you want to be able to effectively, you know, just like any wireless service, you're going to have areas where there's not as much demand and other areas where there is, and so you'll want to be able to dynamically allocate that. Um, but anyway, but yeah, I think, it's kind of funny because, Kook and I talked about this a while back, and from some of these initial posts, people have had some level of skepticism, and they should, right? This is like kind of an early, well, to us who haven't been steeped in it and living, eating, breathing it for years, it seems early. Whereas there's already companies and that have been doing this stuff for quite some time, right? Private companies, but also some of the larger players as well. I mean, overnight or this morning, yeah, it was overnight. There was an article from Wall Street Journal, which I posted about how Blue Origin has already been working on this effort around AI data centers. And then, it seems like, at least from the outside looking in, SpaceX is now recognizing this as a huge growth vector and is going to start trying to put some level of AI compute capacity on their existing satellites. And so, but now you're having a groundswell, right? Like now the theme is in people's minds, and it's an area where people are going to start digging in and trying to understand the physics more of how do you solve these problems in space. For example, on the one hand, yeah, if you're not directly in the sun, space is really cold, and if you can find the right technologies to dissipate the heat, um, there's no air, but if you can use radiators and other methods, being able to cool a data center in space should be economically and environmentally more attractive than doing that on Earth, where you'll need some amount of electricity to pump water, and then that water gets evaporated. But that the water itself, that's a finite resource, right? Like, do you want to use water to water crops, or do you want water to cool AI data centers, right? Like, I guess the long term concern is that these data centers will eat up so much resources, there may not be much room left for humans. And, and so it gets back to in a crazy way, like when you think about the Matrix um or the Terminator, like the future where a just AI compute or some of these things in general kind of usurp all the resources of Earth to the point where there may not be room for humans. But anyway, that's really far into the future. But I think this whole notion of data centers in space helps solve that problem, and at least gives folks an alternative to, okay, I'm going to acquire every square piece of land that I can, and I'm going to build out nuclear reactors, and I'm going to put solar panels everywhere, and I'm going to have like water pumps going, and I'm just going to build as many data centers as I can. Because I think what we'll find is that over the long run, that's just not sustainable, and you're going to have to come up with other potential models. And part of that for long term is putting these things in space. I guess my biggest issue is that the because of these structures, maybe they last, I think maybe 5, 6, 7 years, because I believe that's kind of the lifespan of typical, semiconductors, GPUs that are focused on AI compute. But I think there will have to be a problem solving, perhaps like Starship and Blue Origin eventually, when you have a reusable secondary stage. Hopefully, you pick up some of these assets that are floating out in space that perhaps have run out their useful life, and you bring them back in one piece, instead of trying to force all this stuff to just deorbit and burn up in the atmosphere, which in the long run, like, that's not sustainable either. And so, that's probably one of the biggest concerns, I think, around Starlink, for example, is that they're putting up thousands of satellites up every year, and it's not a one-way street. Like, eventually those satellites, thousands of them, are going to start deorbiting. And so, maybe in the early years that's okay, but over the long run, what does that do to the atmosphere? So that's something to think about. So, which is why I think having larger satellites that can last for, instead of 2 to 3 to 4 years, last 10 years or longer, and then obviously at some point being able to have the technology to deorbit those things safely, where they don't have to be burn up in the atmosphere. I think that's probably another problem that I'm sure humans will focus on and try to solve. But yeah, so going back to this whole idea of AI data centers in the future, like, Scott, when talking yesterday, hinted at some of these things where, and I've talked with management, and I don't think all of us really comprehend, and maybe perhaps at the right time there will be some discussion about it. But I think there is a pretty wide roadmap out there for the company. And if you kind of take a step back, you know, the core market of what we're doing, which is direct to cell and connectivity and comms, you know, that's a huge economic opportunity. And you have to pursue something like that in order to build the what I call the you know the the power and networking platform that will be up there in space. But once you do that, like you can start putting all these other applications on top of it, right? So in 2021, 2022, you know, we talked about the consumer market, but then this whole idea about military applications was far fetched, right? Like I remember Katzi writing about it at length, and he was an early proponent of it. And then, you know, Kook and I speculated about it. You know, you could easily make the case for electronic warfare, like you've got this huge phased array that can beam down signals. And you know, with our experience with Starlink about the interference they cause, like imagine if you purposely try to do that, like you try to jam, you know, in a particular cell where there's military operations going on. It's like, oh, it'd be convenient to take down a terrestrial network while our operations are ongoing, right? And so that's a pretty straightforward use case. But then, you know, CATSI stepped in, talked about PNT, position navigation timing, which is backup to GPS, which is now pretty much all the rage. Like everybody's talking about that. But that's something that our satellites can do. And then radar sensing, because if you have this large powerful phased array and can send signals down to Earth, you can see quite a bit of things in detail that traditional radar can't see. And so that's, I think, what's been one of the key applications for the government's interest in ASD Space Mobile satellites for Golden Dome. But yeah, I mean, the reason why I bring this up is, you know, back in 2022, talking about the idea of military applications, people would kind of laugh it off. It's like, oh, you guys are crazy. You're just trying to hype it and pump it. But the fast forward today, it's like, oh, we've got 9 military contracts. We're going to be generating material revenue in this coming year, and we're on the cusp of getting Golden Dome contracts, which I believe, you know, where there's 2 areas. One is quite large, and the other one is pretty large. But we're on the cusp of getting a contract for Golden Dome, and so um, when I hear like some of the criticisms about bringing up the whole notion of AI data centers in space, it's like, and this is kind of for the regular people, which I include, you know, myself included. When you talk about some of these new areas and themes, the initial thing is to, and this is what we are. This is our default, right? Like as an investor, you're taught to be a skeptic and to always look at things um, with a view of not disbelief, but you know, hey, before I look at any investment idea, I'm going to look at it with a high degree of skepticism, and eventually, you're going to, you know, based off of my work, I'm going to have to address these areas before I'll even consider making an investment, right? And so, this whole idea about AI data centers, I remember when StarCloud released their video and they had this massive solar array floating out in space. The first thing I thought was like, oh, Kessler syndrome. Like, how did that thing going to survive if it gets hit? You know, that looks like a big target. And you know, perhaps like their approach is not the right one, where you're probably going to perhaps have smaller satellites like a Bluebird satellite that can generate you know, 100 to 120 kilowatts of power versus this massive this massive solar array. And then, but I think it's important because like now you're seeing the nuggets kind of dropping where Google is already in the pilot program with Planet Labs to put up 2 CubeSats. StarCloud, I think this morning released that they had just executed their first AI workload on the NVIDIA processor that they put up in space in the CubeSat. And yeah, I mean, Elon Musk, like, God bless him, like the guy knows like where the action is. Like he will see a market opportunity and he will go pursue it. And you know, that happened with direct to cell. I kind of joked with someone that StarCloud, it's kind of a blessing and curse, right? Like when you have uh, Elon Musk say, "Hey, this is a market that's worth pursuing. I'm going to go do it." On the one hand, he sucks the oxygen out of the room, but on the other hand, he brings education and interest. And so, similarly, in August of 2022, when Musk announced with T-Mobile to try to, you know, win the marketing battle, like, "Hey, we're creating this new market called direct to cell, and it's going to change the world, and you're going to be able to use your regular phone and connect in space, and there's going to be no dead zones. And of course, like for those that have been following it, like Abel created AST Space Mobile in 2017, has been working on it for a number of years. But of course, Musk said like, we're the first to ever do this. It's novel. And of course, of course, for an AST Space Mobile shareholder, like that was a bit of heartburn. It's like, oh my god, now we've got to figure out like how to message to people, and you're defending your investment. You're like, okay, yeah, he's entering the market because, and this is the positive side. It's like because it's huge, it's massive. There's a tremendous amount of opportunity, and he's not going to go enter into a market where there's it's like a few hundred million in size. No, he wants to enter markets that have a TAM of billions of dollars. And so for the skeptics back then, they were like, well, it can't be that big. And you know, if they knew about AST Space Mobile, it's like, oh, Starlink's going to crush you guys. Of course, they didn't know anything about the company. But fast forward to today, you've obviously that market's going to be huge. It's basically forming around two players, which is Starlink and AST Space Mobile. Starlink has, I think, I've got to update my numbers, but I think they've got like 10 or 11 MNOs globally, and we've got 50. They cover, I think, like 400 million subscribers, maybe no, 300 million. And then we cover 3 billion subscribers. And so that's a big market, right? And to his credit, he saw that opportunity and he's pursuing it. And it just, if you look at Starlink's growth, a big majority of it's going to come from direct to sell over the coming years. Like if you look at Morgan Stanley or some of these other research analysts that cover SpaceX, you'll look at, especially on the subscriber side, of course, a majority of the growth will be coming from direct to sell. And then in terms of financials, I think it's like 2/3 contribution of top line growth and profitability will be coming from direct to sell. And so that's good. I mean, you've got two players in a duopoly, and that's a huge market. That's where you want to be, right? And so I think the reason why I bring this stuff up is that now, Musk is talking about data centers, and everybody, the initial reaction, just like mine was, maybe a month or two ago, was like, haha, yeah, whatever. But then you dig into it and it's like, oh, this actually makes a ton of sense. And that's where I think, I tweeted this morning about 2026 being the year of space investing. I absolutely believe in that. I mean, it's almost like a coming out party where, for those people who have researched the sector for, 4 or 5 years now, space has been a backwater and it's been like a niche thing, and people kind of poo poo it. But now you've got SpaceX going public, as soon as the end of the summer next year at a $1.5 trillion valuation. Like the amount of capital and mind share and investor interest that's going to draw is going to be huge, right? And so leading up into that, you're going to have, just like we're seeing, I mean, overnight, you're going to have a drumbeat of articles from the popular press, from financial press, like, oh my God, this thing's going public. And, what does it mean? What are they doing? And in the article, like in Bloomberg overnight, you know, folks at SpaceX specifically, the sources specifically said like the 30 billion IPO, like a big part of that allocation is going to go towards this effort of building data centers in space. And so, whether people like it or not, they want to poo-poo it, it's happening and it's going to happen. And whether it's successful or not, who knows? But the amount of CapEx dollars that are going to be thrown at it's real. And it reminds me of like, I remember Steve Larison was telling me and Kook back in 2022, he was telling us about AI and machine learning because, one of his specialties was machine learning. And he was like, yeah, this is going to be huge. And for us, like, there was no real way to invest in it. And I kind of poo-pooed it because I was like, okay, yeah, artificial intelligence, like, that sounds great and all. But then for me, in terms of practical application, like, what do I care? And of course, now, like, I got a subscription to ChatGPT and Gemini, and I use both daily. Like, I almost rarely surf the web. I just like throw shit questions, like everyday questions, like, oh, I'm having a plumbing issue, or how do I optimize this, or the kids have a little rash, like that. Like everything goes into these two chatbots, and oh yeah, I want to create a meme. I want to do something stupid. Like I just throw it in there, or I want to make a video. And so fast forward what 2, 3, 4 years, and that's a very short period of time. Like I'm using in my daily life, I use AI constantly. And so now that I use it, and now I believe in it, I'm like, oh yeah, AI makes a ton of sense. And I subscribe to Google, Gemini, and now it's like integrated in all my apps. And my wife and I, for example, I mean, just we applied for a program for one of our children, and we had to write this letter, and we wrote like general ideas, and we wrote like the meat of it, but then we ran it through ChatGPT, and it put together such a better reading letter. But it's just stuff like that, right? And so if you can imagine, how quickly like technology changes and how we are dismissive of these initial themes. I mean, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when Oklo and SMR were going public, and I saw them as SPACs, I was like, yeah, whatever. Like, okay, modular reactors, and I saw the projections. Like, they're not going to be deploying these things until post 2030, right? Like, they're going to have some test reactors and all this stuff. But I just dismissed it like an idiot. I just poo pooed it, and then these things went public, like SMR and Oklo, like they cratered after despacking. They were at 10, they went into the low single digits or mid single digits. And of course, as any investor, you have that like smug reaction where you're like, ha, see, like I was right. I didn't invest. Thank goodness. When in fact, like, that was just the dynamics of a SPAC going public. And stupidly, like I should have just pulled the trigger and bought some speculatively, but I didn't. And then those things re-rated, like, SMR went to what, the 30s. And then Oklo went to what, 170, 180. Because people then, this AI theme became really big. And then people are like, well, how are they going to power this thing? And then it's like, oh, well, nuclear is going to be a big part of it. And they pulled forward expectations on these highly speculative companies. And similarly, like I think that is what will happen with space, right? Like today, the skeptics will see AST Space Mobile, and you can pick any number of other companies, Rocket Lab. Um, you know, some people have talked about Redwire. Uh, but these companies, people look at them and say, well, they only do this thing. And so why should I ascribe any value for this potential opportunity? Well, the first thing I would say is that in space, yes, there haven't been many large profitable markets. The biggest market is communications, and that's something that AST Space Mobile is pursuing, and it's defining and creating a new category within communications. But outside of that, Earth observation, it's been pretty small, although that's probably growing at a reasonable clip. And then you've got military. I mean, military, there's a whole host of applications. So there hasn't been much. And when you talk to folks in space, they'll tell you like, yeah, there's not like there's a lot of hype and people talking, but there's not really stuff going on. What I mean by that is like beyond just sending up CubeSats and little test things, like there's not real hardware being put up in space that's doing real shit. And so that's why this whole data center opportunity is huge, because this seems like a logical application. Like once you get over you suspend your disbelief, and you get, you put that aside and you kind of think through the end game, right? Which is like, okay, if we keep building data centers here on Earth, what does that do? Well, it's going to take up all the land, it's going to take up all the water, take up electricity. Your bill that's going up every month, that's not sustainable. Like people are going to lose their shit, and it doesn't make sense. And so, where can you do this? Like, I remember 3 years ago, there was a guy. I do some private investing too, and there was a company that was pitching data centers on the moon. And when I saw that, and I was just like, yeah, that makes absolutely no sense, because that's your first reaction. You're just like, why would you put data centers on the moon? And then fast forward to today, like now that data centers are eating up every single resource on Earth, it's like, okay, I get it. Like we need to move in some way, shape, or form, whether it's in orbit or on the moon or somewhere else. Like we need to move this shit off the planet because it's just not sustainable. And you've got to kind of view the opportunity that way, that it's not sustainable. And so you've got to find another place for it. And there's been some discussions about putting data centers underwater. But that's like a whole host of other problems. And It's like, okay, yeah, let's go put that data center underwater and let's like cook the ocean because that's going to be good. So putting it in space, that it solves the cooling problem. I mean, it's not an easy problem. It's still complex, but at least you're putting that heat outside, and in some respects, it's like exchanging the sun's heat. You're running it through a processor, and then it's putting it back out in space where it was already going to be. But but the thing about these companies that are already doing this stuff is space is hard, and we all know that. Like if you're a company that's building a satellite, all the hard things that go into building something that's resilient against radiation, that can go through wild temperature swings, like hundreds of degrees of hot and hundreds of degrees in of cold, and whatever electronics and things that you're putting together, it has to go through that cycle. And so that's why these companies are well positioned for the people who can look beyond just the current applications. But it's like, oh, this guy is building a satellite that's going to the moon. Maybe they'll be good at building satellites that can put a data center up in space. And that's why I think, bringing it back to ASD Space Mobile, like it's important to understand what the company is doing, right? So it's standing up production facilities to build 6 satellites initially, but eventually 10 to 12 satellites a month. And people are like, oh, okay, yeah, they're building satellites. So what? Well, those satellites can generate 100 to 120 kilowatts of power. Um, and they're built to withstand, the harshness of space. And so imagine like this big power generating satellite out there that and already supports multiple processors, has communications built in. Like, okay, I mean, simplistically, you can then imagine repurposing some portions that redesigning it and making it a data center, right? Or a hybrid, like a communications and data center. And so, but then people are like, well, yeah, but maybe other people can do that. No, no, they can't. I mean, they eventually will get there, but this company has 3,800 patents and patent pending claims. It has a novel art. One of the reasons why Starlink has not made a large satellite is because it's hard to unfold that much solar and phased array. Like if you look at a Starlink satellite today, there's a tiny phased array that sits under it. This is for fixed wireless, and then their next generation will have this like extending foldable array that gets. I think they're hoping to get up to 5 by 5 meters, but AST is putting out this phased array that is huge. It's like 2,400 square feet, and that was the biggest problem to solve. And it's like this thing that on one side you have power or solar, on the other side you have antennas, but this thing unfolds. It fits into a standard rocket fairing, and then it unfolds this massive array, which is the size of a basketball court. I mean, that's really hard. And the company has been at it. They've demonstrated 6 times successfully, and they're now ramping up for block 2, which is, the first launch will be on December 20th or as early as December 20th. But this stuff is hard. I mean, just putting it into perspective, like when Scott talks about putting up the most powerful, satellites, in terms of power generating capacity known in civilization, people forget, like, the FM1 and FM2, like those each are 7-ton satellites. Like sometimes people are like, well, production, it's got delayed. And by the way, like that production delays, I think, and I feel very confident about this, the US government is the customer for those 2 satellites. And I think they're part of the HALO program. Like, yeah, customer requirements do change and you do have to make adjustments, which is, I think, part of it. And of course, there has been some production delays because this is the first of its kind. It's the largest. Previously, the Block 1 satellites were the largest phased array in low Earth orbit, and then these are going to dwarf those. Like this is going to be these new satellites are going to be 3 times bigger. And so it's 7 tons for FM1 and FM2, and then on average, the rest of the Block 2 satellites which will be made of composites, are going to be 5.5 tons. Like these are not little CubeSats. It's like Planet Labs. They send up these like tiny Earth observation. They've got like a camera and they've got some power connected to them. And I know Google's like, hey, we're gonna put up 2 test satellites with you guys. Put a processor in a CubeSat. and go see if what the environment does to it and how it impacts compute. Um, if you want to do something at scale that's big, and that's going to be something that Google, who's a current strategic partner and investor, that's like the U.S. government, which is the military, um, Microsoft. I mean, any number of folks who don't want to be captive to the what is forming to be a SpaceX, vertically integrated stack, and that goes as well for Bezos, right? Like he's going to try to build capabilities himself, and there's going to be some potential overlap or competition. Who knows, right? But we do know that Bezos and Abel are friends, and we're in a very, very important customer for them. I mean, we're putting up each satellite. We're putting up 5.5 tons each of payload, and for a rocket company to succeed and to iterate, it needs to go send things up in space, and it can't send tiny things like the Blue Origin New Glenn and 7x2 or 9x4, the heavy. It's going to need real payload, and there's only one game in town. Like there's out of all the customers out there, there's only one cut. Well, there's eventually there will be three customers that are bigger than us in terms of who's sending payloads to space. One is the U.S. government. The second one is SpaceX, Starlink, and then eventually data centers, and the third is Kuiper. But then outside of that, like there's no one else. And so, if you think about like expertise and flight heritage and people who know what they're doing, I know there's like some questions out there. People are saying, well, how are they going to test their first satellite when the Block 2 satellite goes up? Like, what happens? This it's risky. What do they do? And it's like, well, that's space. Like you have to send stuff to space and see if it works, right? And so we've done that successfully with Blue Walker 3. We did that successfully with Block 1. The 5 Bluebirds 1 through 5. Those all unfolded successfully. They've all been testing well. And sure enough, Verizon and Saudi Telecom, they've seen the test results. They looked at reports. They've spoken to the company. They've diligenced it, and they like what they see. And what Saudi Telecom recently did the deal back in October. And so there's not many companies that pulled off what AST has done, right? Like they're throwing up 6 to 7 ton satellites in space with the largest phased array, generating the most power that can communicate with Earth. And they also have optical inter-satellite links as well enabled, which originally wasn't part of the plan, but the government required that, and so that's now part of the salary as well. And so I think I remember clearly, like speaking to the company. It was a conversation like back in 2023, 2022, and it's not as if these folks are sitting on their hands. Like, okay, we're going to be done with Block 3. Like once a Midband and Bluebirds are like, we're going to be done. Yeah, we've stood up this 12 satellite per month capacity, and we're just going to call it a day and just start counting the dollars as they come in. No, they're going to keep going. Like they're going to, I tweeted this earlier today. It's this, you've got to like think beyond just what that constellation up in space means and the capability to put that shell and additional shells. It's like you're putting up a platform in space that's going to generate a tremendous amount of power, and that is networked. And so what can you do with that? Like you're going to enable 5G communications and eventually 6G to devices. You're going to have position, navigation, timing. You're going to have radar. You're going to have sensing, electronic warfare, and AI compute. Like AI compute, when I think about all the problems that you have to solve, like that seems to me like probably one of the easier problems to solve. Easier meaning all the infrastructure is there. You would have to probably improve the connectivity within the array. And now I'm dating myself, but like you might have to lay down like InfiniBand interconnects between the processors, and you're probably gonna have to cut down the number of processors that you can carry the array. But the funny thing is like that array actually is a passive radiator. That's the way they designed it. And so instead of like jamming all these processors into a very tight box, you actually distribute them, and you use the array as a passive radiator. And so if you can imagine like this thing that's out in space and you can do all sorts of cool stuff with it, like there's a lot of different applications. I remember one of the things that Scott mentioned to me, this is when back in 2021, like we were talking about this is before he joined the company. He's like, there's a lot of cool things you can do with array. Like the array doesn't. By the way, you don't necessarily have to be listening to Earth. It also works the other way, and so these things can actually listen for things out in space. And so, I know, like, there's researchers who are upset that perhaps, like, for example, Starlink, if you get all thousands and thousands and thousands of satellites, like, it's gonna impact the ability for, astronomers to do optical or radio listening, in space. Well, guess what? Like, we've got this huge platform that's orbiting space, like, you can use that for scientific purposes. Like, we're gonna listen for signals and all kinds of crazy things. It doesn't necessarily have to be just applicable to Earth. And so, I think, what I was the tweet that I had posted before that it's pinned, this is like the challenge of being an investor, right? Like you've got to find the themes before they become something that people latch onto, and whether it's hype and it blows up, but then it fails miserably, or you have this hype cycle, but then it actually catches on and it becomes reality. The key thing is to be early and to understand what you own and if it's applicable, right? Like, when Quantum, like IonQ and some of these other companies went public, like, I looked at them personally and I was like, "Okay, this is a pipe dream." Like, I don't think, and everyone latches onto the whole notion, and by the way, I'm not invested in them, but I'm just using an example. Like, everyone latches on to the notion that, quantum computers are so many years away, there's no practical applications for them, so why should I invest? Because I want to see, like, something now. It's all about, like, now. But that's not, and maybe if you're a value investor or someone conservative, then sure, then that's your lane. But if you're a growth investor and you're looking for kind of the next themes, and this is what, ARK infamously tries to do with their big ideas every year, um, you have to think steps ahead. And I think this data center kind of theme right now, and of course, SpaceX going public in 2026, like this is going to be huge. And the reason why it's huge is that people see the billions of dollars that are being allocated to the data centers on Earth, and then they can extrapolate that pretty easily to space and it's not going to happen overnight. And you're going to need the cost per kilogram to go down even more, which once New Glenn, you know, in its current configuration, but then in the future heavy configuration, and Starship, when that eventually gets going, it's going to become really cheap to send this stuff up. And so when you look at the total cost of ownership and operations, which some of the biggest inputs are electricity and of course like land, space solves a lot of that. And so that's why I'm super excited about this coming year, because every company is going to be touched by it, and people are going to be looking for ways. I mean, just like individual investors and institutional investors are going to be looking for ways to invest in this theme. And then, but put those people aside, like the actual strategics in that, where this is going to touch, they're going to be looking for partners, right? So these data center companies are going to say, okay, yeah, the going's going to be good for the next 1 or 2 decades, maybe. But then in the future, I've got to diversify. I've got to figure out, like, how do I parlay this into space? And then do I go work with SpaceX? Like, do I trust those guys? What value do I add? Right. Because SpaceX has a ton of money, and I bring some expertise around how to architect a data center, but yeah, maybe I can contribute that and we can figure something out. Um, but then there's only so many players who will play with SpaceX, and then it's like, okay, well, who else is out there? Well, I could maybe go work with Bezos, or I could go work with AST Space Mobile, or I could work with Rocket Lab. And so that's the opportunity. Like, there was someone skeptical overnight who was like, well, who's going to come up with 20 or 30 billion dollars needed to build some of this stuff? And it's like, customers. Customers are going to come up with it. I mean, that's what they're doing. The customers are giving data centers money, long-term contracts. Here, we're going to give you money. Go build it. Go do it. And so, who's going to fund it? Customers. Like, they're going to go. These data center companies or the U.S. government is going to go to ASD Space Mobile and say, "Hey, it looks like you have all the right ingredients, and you have the ability and the production capacity to go build this stuff. You have the building blocks. You have the patents. You have everything. Uh, let's do an agreement. Like I'm gonna give you like $20 billion to build some prototypes, and then I want to contract with you to actually put up a shell of these things. Like that's the opportunity. And for some people who are like, well, it's detracting from the business model. Like, I don't know if we want to go focus in that area. You don't have to. Like, you you can just build it for someone else and let them run it. I mean, if you can imagine standing up a factory and just making a few different changes, and I'm simplifying things, but if you make some changes to a Bluebird satellite, you can build it for somebody and you're like the prime, and then they can go run it. Um, or in a very simple way, you can license your patents and collect really high margin royalties. Um, and this is something that, you know, we've talked about for a number of years, where eventually these patents are going to come around and be worth something, right? And historically, they probably weren't because no one wants to do stuff in space besides communications and again, like observation and maybe some of these radar applications. But then now you've got a killer application, and it's going to need a lot of the patents that you have, and so that's going to be a money making machine. Like, not only are people going to come to you to license those patents, and for example, the patent that we talked about, the Micron, which is able to dissipate heat, it's a big radiator in space. That patent's from 2021. Like, there's a whole trove of this stuff, and it's all relevant. And so, companies are going to come to you to license I mean, a lot of these patents are fundamental in terms of, satellite technology and operations in space. But then, so people are going to come to you to license them. Then, of course, there's going to be some people who are like, screw those guys. I'm just going to use it. And then that's going to, if you recall all the IP wars, like around semiconductors and over the last several years, like that's going to become a big thing. And AST has has us has folks who are focused on enforcing those patents. They haven't done that yet, but eventually that will become a big standalone business in and of itself. And for those that are unfamiliar, I mean, if you look at NAND semiconductors, like the old SanDisk, actually don't know about SanDisk in its current form, but back in the day, a significant part of the revenues and profitability came from their patents around NAND flash, which then Samsung, Toshiba, any number of players had to pay them royalties for every single NAND flash chip they sold. They had to send patent royalty to the company. And so, yeah, I mean, it's an exciting time. I'm super bullish. I think the previous high of $100, and I don't typically like talk about stock price targets or anything like that, but I feel like the high that we reached in October, which candidly part of that was like just in general, high beta names just outperforming. I think that's going to be like a new all time low. Like, this 2026 is gearing up for some really special things. Because you're gonna have a whole host of, like, new investors looking to invest in space. We fit so many different categories, and we also are a platform for what I believe is gonna be the next big thing, which is data centers in space. And so, yeah, I would just say, like, and as people kind of start understanding this opportunity, and you'll see a lot of skeptics and people poo-pooing it, but overall, like, it's important to zoom out and just focus and see the bigger picture. Like, when people start extrapolating what the opportunity is and what it means, they're going to start pulling forward the opportunity in terms of discounting that, right? And so that's where you get these types of situations, like in quantum, or you get, in modular nuclear reactors, where these things are not going to be relevant for everyday use, 5, 10 years, maybe 5, 10 years from now. But people are willing to discount that forward and give those companies credit. And that's similar. The analogy around AI, where I poo-pooed it 3, 4 years ago, and ignored it, but now I use AI in everything that I do today. And so that's a mindset you got to have. You've got to be able to kind of look forward what's going to be hot in 2026 and relevant. And it seems like AI data centers are that. And so there's one company that has the building blocks and the capability and will have the production to make it a reality, right? And I think that's something that I'm thinking about quite a bit more. It's like who can put together a 6 to 7 ton satellite with that much power generation? There aren't many, and SpaceX can't do that either. Like the Starlink satellites, um, they're smaller in size, and they generate a decent amount of power, but they're going to have to re-architect those things, and we already know about the issues they have as it exists to deliver their current service. But eventually they'll get there and they'll be smart. But the beauty of this all is that and you'll hear this from some from space mob who are zealots, but you'll hear this from the big guys. Or sorry, the big like SpaceX fanboys. They're like, oh well, SpaceX is going to win the whole thing and just take everything. And it's like, no, that's not how the market works, guys. Like, there's going to be room for multiple players. Like the opportunity is so big, you're going to it's gonna be tremendous, and there's gonna be room for everybody. Or not room for everybody, but for a few leaders, right? And so that's the opportunity today. That's what I wanted to talk about, is that you're being able to shift your mindset, think about what's gonna be big in the coming year, and what is the zeitgeist? Like, what's gonna be occupying people's minds? And SpaceX is gonna be top of mind. It's gonna be top of mind, $1.5 trillion IPO, $30 billion primary raise. Um, and when they go on a roadshow and talk to Fidelity, Wellington, Capital Group, a whole host of investors all around the world, they're going to talk about like direct to sell. It's going to be a huge growth vector for them. They're going to talk about AI data centers. And so when those investors who, for the first time, are hearing about this area, you're going to be like, oh, that's pretty cool. And it's pretty big because this company is going out of 1.5 trillion valuation and the projections look pretty hot. What else is out there? Like, okay, I'm going to try to get an allocation IPO, and then I assume I'll get some, but then maybe I need to form a specialist group to focus on space and figure out like what these other companies are doing, because there's a few of these companies that are 20 billion in market cap that seem to be doing quite well. Like, what are they doing? Maybe we should go meet with management and go invest. And so that's where you have this aha moment, like this immediate re-rating of awareness where it's like, shit, I need to put money to work in this area. And that's where you have like these overnight, almost what it seems like overnight, but what tends to be like multiple weeks, multiple months, like a sector completely re-rating because people are now discovering the opportunity and capital dollars want to go into those names. And so that's what we face right now. Um, that's been a long 4 or 5 years for many of us. But space is having it's going to have its moment. It already is. It already is. It's like the topic du jour, like SpaceX and what they're doing. People are trying to figure out, okay, well, where should I invest and what are the companies that are doing this? And they're going to find out like, oh, there's actually a few of these companies that are ahead of SpaceX, or they're going to build out a pretty significant market in a duopoly or an oligopoly with SpaceX. And so I want to go invest in those companies too. And so anyway, that's all I had for everybody. I think, I think, yeah, this is going to be huge. And for people, yeah, call me crazy, call me a pumper, whatever it is. Like, I really don't care. My job is to make money, and I want to know where the puck is going, and I'm doing that now. And that's what you should do too. You should, you should dig in, really get smart on data centers in space, really get smart on direct to sell, really get smart on Golden Dome, and figure out who are the companies that are well positioned to go execute on this. And are they reasonably valued relative to the opportunity? And if they are, I need to figure out a way to get exposure. That's your job. And yeah, there's going to be volatility, painful drawdowns. And by the way, like that's a feature, it's not a bug. Like that's for any growth sector, any growth stocks, like that stuff happens. But again, this is a reminder to go out there and do your work, do your due diligence and be ready, because the amount of attention and focus is coming. And we're going to be surprised by it. I think we all are. I mean, if you had asked me HC Space Mobile during the dumps, when the stock was, the company was at a $700 million market cap, which by the way, like some retail Space Mob holders uh, own back then, if we had owned as much as we do now in terms of dollar amounts, like we would own, we would own the entire company in terms of market cap. But anyway, but um, but that shows you how quickly things can change, right? As the company gets to the point of execution and revenues, which is where we are now. But then once the company is up and running and commercial service is going and we're building all these satellites, that's when the company will have the latitude to start talking about some of these other opportunities that it is working on. And I think, again, if you haven't already, go back and listen to Scott speaking at UBS because he dropped some pretty big hints, and I think those were intentional. And so this company, as we've known, has been quite conservative in terms of discussing these things until they become more of a reality. And so that kind of tells me that, for example, when we talked about at the beginning, I think Golden Dome, we should be hearing something, in the coming weeks, perhaps, at latest is it sometime in January, but that seems like fait accompli at this point. So anyway, I'll end it up there and there. If hope this was interesting, helpful. I'm sure, like I said before, have another space tonight or tomorrow because like things are changing. But yeah, we'll talk again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the AST Space Mover podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest news about AST Space Mover, make sure to subscribe. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.
We're doing something very, very big. And I think with this technology, we can really affect a billion lives. AST Space Mover is the only company that has proven technology to deliver cellular broadband connectivity directly from space to your everyday smartphone. People will just basically turn their phone and be seamless, regardless of where you are. We don't want the user even to know that it's connected by satellite. Our role is to bring this into reality, always in partnership with the MNOs. Listen. Waffles.